31 people have been arrested following a major investigation into human trafficking. Police in York Region, north of Toronto, say officers from several provinces took part in the operation. More than 300 charges have been laid. The lead inspector says it appears to be run by a criminal organization operating across Canada.
The uniqueness of this is that we've actually identified an actual criminal organization that is not only involved, primarily involved with human trafficking, but they're involved with every other offense that we've listed, predominantly frauds. And what we've identified is that organized frauds are occurring across the country. The profit from the frauds that the organization is making is fueling the human trafficking.
CBC's Ellen Morrow was at that news conference. What else did police reveal, Ellen?
Well, Suhanna, York Regional Police described an elaborate human trafficking network, an alleged human trafficking network. I spoke to Ty Trong, the inspector who you heard just there. He said this is one of the most sophisticated alleged networks he's ever seen in his decade of looking into these crimes. And the numbers here are staggering. As you said, police believe, they say, this network spanned the entire country, with women being trafficked largely from Quebec to Ontario to Western provinces. And as you also said, they've arrested more than 30 people in connection with this alleged crime network. More than 300 charges have been laid, and more charges are expected as this is an ongoing investigation. And 12 victims have been officially identified. Now, this investigation, called Project Convalesce, began a year ago in October 2018 when police, the York Regional Police, began looking into a man named Jonathan Anguilla, believed to be the alleged kingpin of this organization. And the reason they began looking into him at that time was two women who were in Vaughan, Ontario, not far from Toronto, came forward to authorities. Inspector Trong said those women were essentially at the end of their rope and had nowhere else to turn to, so reached out to the police. Now, Inspector Trong also went over the scope of this alleged network, as well as some of the methods he says the suspected pimps used to control the alleged victims. Here's more of what he had to say.
They were working for him. They tried to leave and tried to make their own money, and at which point he tracked them down and tried to make sure that that didn't happen. We're seeing a lot of girls that will try and leave their pimp on their own, try and evade the violence, and they get found, they get beaten, they get assaulted as a result of getting found.
This is an ongoing investigation, Alan, so there might be more to come, but did police give any indication of where the investigation is taking them?
Well, they say they've identified 30 other women as potentially connected with this alleged network. They're urging those women to come forward and speak to authorities, although they're also acknowledging that's a difficult thing for women in this type of organization to do. And this still is an investigation that is spanning across multiple provinces. It is ongoing, so police couldn't get into too much of the specifics, but their priority is reaching out to those 30 other women potentially connected and helping them to potentially escape this network and get the supports that they need.
Thanks for that, Ellen. CBC's Ellen Morrow in Aurora, Ontario. We are following a developing story just north of Toronto. Police have arrested 31 people in a major investigation into human trafficking and organized crime. My next guest is a human trafficking survivor. She is also the founder of what's called the RISE Initiative. It's a project aimed at helping victims of human trafficking. Ronelle Bruder is in Toronto. Ronelle, great to have you on the program. And this is a huge story and a huge investigation. Yeah. Police say hundreds of charges, including for human trafficking and pimping, and 45 young women could be involved as victims. Does any of this surprise you?
Sadly, it doesn't surprise me. My trafficking situation happened almost 20 years ago, So this has been going on for a long time. It's just only recently that human trafficking is getting attention.
Police did call it a unique investigation, though. Based on what, would you say?
I think it was the fact that it was so organized. So typically what you see in human trafficking is you'll have one trafficker or a pimp with a couple of girls, a stable of girls. But what it seems like what they had here was 4 or 5 multiple different traffickers working together in an organized format and actually trading the girls between them.
The girls were being moved mainly from Quebec, the majority of them, but to Ontario and other provinces across the country. Is that par for the course as well?
Yes, that's very common. So one of the things the traffickers try to do is isolate and also disorient their victims. So moving them from place to place, that makes it easier. So the young girls don't know where they are, harder to ask for help.
I want to say these are all charges right now. These are only allegations, so there certainly will be further investigatory details, etc., and we'll be watching for those. But as for the women who have come forward, police say there were 45 young women involved. Only a dozen or so are speaking out. Let me get your thoughts on how difficult it is to point the finger, even though perhaps you know you might be safe now.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a real challenge for law enforcement. One reason, just obviously the fear of violence and threats if they speak against their trafficker. And also for a lot of the women, just the shame and the stigma around this, not wanting to go out and actually having to publicly announce that you are a survivor of human trafficking.
How big a problem is that, the stigma? Because, you know, we say, and we see ads for it, let's talk about things. Let's talk about, mental illness. Let's talk about breast cancer. Let's talk about things that perhaps were subjects people weren't comfortable with. Why isn't this on that list of let's talk about it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different reasons why human trafficking isn't something that you really see a lot of people talking about. But I think there's a lot of shame just around women working in the sex industry in general. So there's a lot of stigma there. And so for survivors of human trafficking, there's a lot of guilt because this is something that they have this experience. A lot of people might actually blame them. Mm-hmm. Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you run away? Because a lot of people don't understand the psychological and emotional trauma that traffickers inflict on their victims.
So let me say to you honestly, those are questions running through my mind. How do you answer them?
Sorry, which questions?
The questions of why didn't you leave?
Yeah, and so I was just kind of speaking to that point. It's really due to the psychological trauma. So traffickers are able to sort of groom their victims, create the sense that they're the only person that matters, they're the only person in the world that you have, and they instill such fear, such physical fear and emotional fear that for many women, they're afraid to leave. They're afraid to even ask to go to the washroom. I mean, this is the level of control and fear that these traffickers are inflicting.
Final question for you. What will you be watching for in the days ahead as we continue here on CBC News Network to track this story, Ronelle?
Yeah, so really, I'm hoping to see more charges come out of this. So I'm really interested in, I think it's the remaining 33 women that they've discovered, and I'm hoping that there'll be more charges of human trafficking against these men.
I thank you for being so forthcoming and talking about this. As you say, no stigma, got to talk about it, right?
Exactly. That's the only way that we can address the problem, if we have these conversations.
I thank you for your time. That's Ronelle Bruder. She is a survivor of human trafficking, and our chase team reached her in Toronto.